In the winter of 1941, high above the warm waters of the South China Sea, a lone B-17 flying fortress droned through the clouds. Its engines hummed steadily. Its crew, tired, tense, but alert, scanned the horizon. They were flying from Hawaii to the Philippines, part of a desperate reinforcement effort after months of rising tension with Japan. None of them knew it yet, but they were flying into history, and into a storm of disbelief. Because when Japanese pilots first saw the B-17, they didn't fear it, they laughed. To them, this American bomber looked absurd. It was huge, over 74 feet long, with a wingspan wider than a basketball court. It lumbered through the sky like a clumsy freighter, not a warplane. It had no sleek lines, no fighter-like agility. Instead, it bristled with machine guns, turrets on top, underneath, in the nose and in the tail, 13 guns on early models. To the Japanese, that wasn't strength, it was desperation. If a plane needs that many guns, one Imperial Navy officer reportedly said, it must be too slow to escape. And in December 1941, that belief seemed justified. Just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese bombers and Zeros struck Clark Field in the Philippines. On the ground sat 18 brand-new B-17s. They had arrived only days before, flown across the Pacific in a grueling 13-hour non-stop hop from California. The crews were exhausted. The planes were fueled and armed, but parked in the open, with no camouflage, no revetments, no warning. Why? Because U.S. commanders didn't believe Japan would strike so soon. They thought they had time. They were wrong. At 12:35 p.m. on December 8, 1941, just 10 hours after Pearl Harbor, Japanese bombers appeared overhead. Anti-aircraft guns fired, but too late. Within minutes, bombs rained down, hangars exploded, fuel trucks turned into fireballs, and those 18 B-17s, half were destroyed outright. The rest were riddled with shrapnel, their wings torn, engines ruined. One crew watched in horror as their plane, named the Swoos, caught fire and melted into the tarmac. Japanese pilots circled back, strafing the wreckage with machine gun fire. Over their radios they joked, "The Americans brought us presents," one said. Back in Tokyo, newspapers ran headlines mocking the "Flying Coffin" and the "Fortress of Folly." Military planners concluded that U.S. air power in the Pacific was broken. They believed the war would be over before America could recover. But here's what they missed. The B-17 wasn't just a plane. It was the tip of a spear America hadn't even finished forging. The Flying Fortress is forged. Let's go back a few years, to 1934. The U.S. Army Air Corps wanted a bomber that could fly deep into enemy territory, drop its payload, and fight its way back alone, no escorts needed. Boeing answered with the Model 299. On its first test flight, it carried a record 2,500 pounds of bombs over 2,000 miles. Army officials were stunned. A Seattle reporter watching it taxi called it a flying fortress. The name stuck. But the Model 299 crashed during a demonstration, not from mechanical failure, but because the pilot forgot to release the control locks. The Army chose a smaller, cheaper bomber instead. Boeing nearly went bankrupt. Yet a few visionaries in the Air Corps refused to give up. They ordered 13 YB-17s for testing. Then came war in Europe. France and Britain placed orders. Slowly, quietly, the B-17 found champions. By 1941, the B-17C and D models were in service. They had 4 Wright 1820 Cyclone engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower. Top speed, 290 miles per hour. Service ceiling, over 30,000 feet. Range, 2,000 miles. And yes, they were loaded with guns, but they were also fragile. Early models lacked self-sealing fuel tanks. A single incendiary round could ignite the entire wing. and their bomb load, just 4,000 pounds, was modest compared to later bombers. Still, they represented a philosophy: precision daylight bombing. The idea was simple: fly in tight formations, use overlapping fields of fire from multiple planes to create a box of bullets no enemy fighter could penetrate. Drop bombs with optical sights from high altitude to hit factories, rail yards, and shipyards, not cities. It was a moral stance, as much as a tactical one. War should be clean, surgical, not like the terror bombing of civilians. That belief would be tested in fire, ice, and blood. Back in the Philippines, the surviving B-17s retreated to Australia. There, under the command of General Louis Brereton, they launched desperate raids against Japanese invasion fleets. Fuel was so scarce that crews siphoned gas from trucks. Bombs were hand-loaded. Spare parts came from crashed planes, yet they flew. On December 10, 1941, Captain Colin Kelly took off from Del Monte Field in Mindanao. His target? A Japanese invasion force heading for Luzon. Flying through heavy cloud cover, Kelly spotted what he believed was the battleship Haruna. He dove through anti-aircraft fire and released his bombs. His crew saw a massive explosion. They radioed, "Battleship sunk!" Kelly turned for home, but his B-17 was hit. One engine caught fire. He ordered his crew to bail out. All but one survived. Kelly stayed at the controls until the end. Newspapers hailed him as the first American hero of the war. Later analysis showed he likely hit the heavy cruiser Ashigata, and it survived. But the truth didn't matter. The story did. It gave a grieving nation hope. It proved the B-17 could strike back, even in defeat. For the next year, the Flying Fortress fought a losing battle in the Pacific. Japanese Zeros climbed faster, turned tighter, and outgunned the B-17 at lower altitudes. The vast distances of the ocean made navigation a nightmare. Weather systems swallowed planes whole. And without fighter escorts, P-40s couldn't fly that far, the bombers were vulnerable. But something was changing. While Japan built planes in small workshops, often by hand, America was turning its factories into weapons of mass production. In 1940, the U.S. built fewer than 3,000 military aircraft. By 1944, it built over 96,000. Ford's Willow Run plant alone produced one B-24 every 63 minutes. Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed churned out B-17s at a rate that defied belief. At peak output, a new B-17 rolled off the assembly line every 59 minutes. Each one carried 10 men: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, radio operator, and 4 gunners: waist, tail, top turret, and ball turret. The ball turret gunner hung beneath the plane in a plexiglass bubble, knees tucked to his chest, hands on twin 50-caliber machine guns. At 30,000 feet, the temperature dropped to minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Frost formed on the inside of the glass. If the hydraulics failed, he could be trapped, frozen in place, until the plane landed. These men weren't just soldiers. They were brothers. They named their planes after sweethearts: Lucky Lady, Satan's Angel, My Gal Sal. They painted nose art: pin-up girls, cartoon devils, snarling tigers. It was superstition, identity, a way to say, "This is ours." And they were about to get a new weapon. In 1942, Boeing introduced the B-17E. This was the first true flying fortress. It added a tail gunner, finally giving defense against the deadly head-on and rear attacks German and Japanese fighters loved. It had a powered dorsal turret on top and a Sperry ball turret underneath. Armor plating protected the crew. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced fire risk. Total armament jumped to 10 50-caliber machine guns. Later, the B-17F added more guns. The B-17G, arriving in 1943, added a chin turret, two forward-firing guns to counter head-on assaults. Now, the B-17 wasn't just defending itself. It was hunting. In the Pacific, tactics evolved. High-altitude bombing wasn't always effective against ships, so crews began skip bombing, flying just 200 feet above the waves, dropping bombs that skipped like stones into the sides of enemy transports. It was terrifying. One gust of wind, one misjudged wave, and you'd crash. But it worked. At the Battle of the Bismarck Sea in March 1943, U.S. and Australian bombers, including B-17s, attacked a Japanese convoy carrying 7,000 troops to New Guinea. Flying through monsoon rains, they sank all 8 transports and 4 destroyers. Over 3,000 Japanese soldiers drowned. Survivors reported seeing hundreds of planes filling the sky. In truth, it was about 100, but to men in lifeboats, it felt like the end of the world. That battle marked a turning point. Japan could no longer move troops by sea without massive losses. Their island garrisons were cut off, starving, forgotten. And the B-17 was just getting started. By mid-1943, American forces were island-hopping across the Pacific, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Kwajalein. Each victory brought airfields closer to Japan. B-17s moved forward with them. From bases in the Solomons and New Guinea, they bombed Rabaul, Truk, and Palau, Japan's major naval hubs. They cratered runways, sank supply ships, destroyed fuel dumps. Japanese pilots who once laughed now scrambled to intercept, only to find themselves outnumbered and outgunned. One Japanese ace, Saburo Sakai, later wrote, "We were told the B-17 was slow and easy to kill, but when you faced a formation of 20 with guns blazing from every angle, you realized this was not a bird. It was a fortress, in truth." The psychological impact was just as powerful as the physical damage. For years, Japanese civilians were told their homeland was sacred, protected by divine winds and brave warriors. They believed America was weak, divided, and thousands of miles away. Then, in late 1944, B-17s began appearing over Kyushu. At first, only a few, then dozens, then hundreds. Air raid sirens wailed, blackout curtains went up. Children were sent to the countryside. Factory workers hid in tunnels. The myth of invincibility cracked. And the men who flew those missions, they carried the weight of a nation on their shoulders. Take the crew of Hell's Angels. In May 1943, they became the first B-17 to complete 25 combat missions in Europe. But in the Pacific, crews often flew far more. Missions lasted 10 to 12 hours. You sat in freezing cold, listening to the drone of engines, watching for fighters, and praying your oxygen mask wouldn't freeze. If your plane was hit, you patched holes with tape and prayers. If a crewmate was wounded, you gave him your morphine. If he died, you strapped his body to the floor and kept flying. There was no glory in it, only duty. And soon that duty would bring them within striking distance of Tokyo itself. But before that final push, there was one more lesson for Japan to learn, the hard way. Because the B-17 wasn't just changing tactics, it was changing the very nature of war. And the Japanese laughter? It had long since turned to silence. By the summer of 1943, the B-17 Flying Fortress was no longer the underdog. It was becoming the backbone of American air power, not just in Europe, but across the vast expanse of the Pacific. And the men who flew it were no longer rookies. They were hardened veterans who had stared down Zero fighters, survived flak storms, and buried friends in the ocean or in unmarked graves on forgotten islands. They knew the B-17 wasn't perfect, but they also knew something the Japanese still refused to accept. This plane could take a beating and keep flying. One of the most famous examples happened on June 13, 1943. A B-17F named All-American, part of the 97th Bomb Group, was returning from a raid on Tunis when it collided with a German Messerschmitt Bf-109. The fighter sliced clean through the rear fuselage, shearing off the left horizontal stabilizer and tearing a massive hole in the tail section. The tail gunner was knocked unconscious. The rudder was half gone. The plane should have spiraled into the sea, but it didn't. Pilot Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg held the controls with white knuckles. The crew used parachutes to block the worst of the wind tearing through the cabin. They jerry-rigged control cables with spare wire. For 2 hours they flew like that, 20,000 feet over enemy territory with half their tail missing. When they finally landed in Algeria, ground crews stared in disbelief. Photos of the mangled plane made headlines around the world. The headline in Stars and Stripes read, "This is why they call it a fortress." That kind of resilience wasn't luck, it was design. The B-17 had a rugged airframe built with redundant systems. If one engine failed, it could fly on 3. If 2 failed, it could still limp home on 2, barely. Its wings were so strong they could absorb hits that would cripple other bombers. Crews told stories of planes coming back with entire sections of wing missing, engines on fire, and landing gear shot off. They'd belly land in fields, and the crew would walk away. In the Pacific, that toughness saved lives every day. Take the story of Sergeant James "Red" Williams, a ball turret gunner with the 5th Bomb Group. On a mission over Rabaul in November 1943, his B-17 took a direct hit from anti-aircraft fire. Shrapnel shredded the ball turret, wounding Williams in the leg and arm. Blood pooled in the cramped space. His oxygen line was cut. But he kept firing, tracking a Zero that was diving on the plane's left flank. He hit it. The fighter spiraled into the sea. Only then did he pass out. His crewmates dragged him up through the narrow crawlway, applied tourniquets, and flew 6 hours back to base. Williams survived. He later said, "I wasn't brave, I was just scared to let my buddies down." That was the spirit of the B-17 crews. Not heroics, loyalty. And that loyalty was tested on every mission. Daylight bombing meant flying in perfect formation, box after box of B-17s stacked in 3-dimensional grids across the sky. Each plane protected the others. Waist gunners covered the flanks, top turrets watched above, ball turrets scanned below, tail gunners guarded the 6 o'clock position. If a fighter attacked, it faced a wall of 50 caliber fire from multiple directions. The Germans called it Flak Alley. The Japanese called it the Iron Sky. But staying in formation was agony. You couldn't dodge flak, you couldn't weave to avoid fighters, you held your position. Even as bombs fell from planes above, even as planes next to you exploded. One veteran recalled watching a B-17 beside him take a direct hit. 1 second it was there, the next it was just gone. Pieces falling like confetti. We didn't say a word. We just kept flying. The psychological toll was immense. Crews developed rituals to cope. Some kissed a lucky coin before takeoff. Others carried a photo of their mother tucked into their flight suit. Many refused to name their plane until they'd flown 5 missions, because naming it meant you believed you'd survive long enough to care. And survival was never guaranteed. Of the 12,731 B-17s built during the war, nearly 4,700 were lost to enemy action. That's over 1 in 3. In the Pacific alone, hundreds vanished over ocean or jungle, their crews never found. The 11th Bomb Group lost 37 planes in just 6 months of operations from the Gilbert Islands. One squadron flew 42 missions before completing its first full tour. Yet they kept flying. Why? Because they saw the results. By late 1943, B-17s were systematically dismantling Japan's outer defense ring. Rabaul, the great Japanese naval base on New Britain, was once considered impregnable. It housed over 100,000 troops, dozens of airfields, and a deep-water harbor. But beginning in October 1943, U.S. bombers, including waves of B-17s, began pounding it daily. They hit runways, they cratered docks, they sank supply ships in the harbor. Within months, Rabaul was neutralized. Not invaded, but rendered useless. Japanese planes couldn't take off. Ships couldn't unload. The garrison was left to rot. It was a new kind of warfare, strategic isolation, and the B-17 was its hammer. From bases in the Solomons and New Guinea, B-17s ranged as far as Truk Lagoon, Japan's Pearl Harbor of the Pacific. In February 1944, during Operation Hailstone, over 60 B-17s joined Navy carrier planes in a massive raid on Truk. They sank 45 ships, destroyed 275 aircraft, and turned the lagoon into a graveyard of steel. Survivors described the sky as black with smoke and planes. One Japanese sailor wrote in his diary, "The Americans are not coming one by one. They come like locusts. There is no escape." Back in Tokyo, Imperial headquarters grew uneasy. They had assumed the Pacific was too vast for sustained bombing. They believed their island chain would absorb any American thrust. But the B-17, combined with the Navy's island-hopping campaign, was proving them wrong. Each captured island became a new launch pad. Each raid cut deeper into Japan's supply lines. And then came the Marianas. In June 1944, U.S. Marines landed on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These islands were only 1,500 miles from Tokyo, well within range of the B-29 Superfortress, but also reachable by B-17s for shorter missions. As soon as the airfields were secured, B-17 groups moved in. From Isley Field on Saipan, they began striking Iwo Jima, Chichijima, and the Japanese home islands themselves. One mission in November 1944 stands out. 20 B-17Gs of the 307th Bomb Group took off before dawn, bound for the Nakajima Aircraft Factory on Kyushu. It was a precision target, the same factory that built Zero fighters. The formation climbed to 25,000 feet, flying through thin cloud cover. As they approached the coast, Japanese radar picked them up. Air raid sirens blared across Kagoshima, but the interceptors were slow to respond. Japan's pilot reserves were nearly gone. Most of their best aviators had died at Midway, the Solomons, and the Philippine Sea. The B-17s dropped 500-pound general-purpose bombs through breaks in the clouds. Post-Drake photos showed the factory roof collapsed, assembly lines destroyed, and dozens of Zeros burned on the tarmac. The mission lasted 9 hours. All planes returned. One had a hole in its wing, big enough to crawl through, but the pilot landed safely. For the first time, Japanese civilians saw American bombers over their cities. Not just carrier planes on hit-and-run raids, but heavy bombers flying in disciplined waves. The message was clear. The war had come home, and the B-17 was delivering it. But perhaps the most overlooked role of the Flying Fortress in the Pacific was maritime patrol. With its long range and heavy payload, it was perfect for hunting enemy shipping. B-17s flew Black Cat missions at night, using radar to find convoys in the dark. They dropped parachute flares to illuminate targets, then bombed from low altitude. In 1944 alone, B-17s sank over 120 Japanese merchant ships, cutting off food, fuel, and ammunition to isolated garrisons. On Palau, Japanese troops resorted to eating rats. On Wake Island, they boiled leather shoes for soup. On Truk, sailors traded cigarettes for rice. The B-17 didn't always drop the final bomb, but it made sure the enemy starved before the Marines arrived. This was total war, not just battles, but blockade. Not just destruction, but deprivation. And through it all, the crews kept flying. Consider the story of Captain William Bill Taylor, pilot of Lucky 13. On his 32nd mission over Formosa in January 1945, his plane took hits from both flak and fighters. 2 engines failed. The oxygen system froze. 1 gunner was killed. Taylor ordered the crew to bail out over friendly territory, but the radio operator, a 19-year-old from Iowa named Tommy Reeves, refused. "I'm staying with you, Skipper," he said. Together, they nursed the crippled B-17 back to Okinawa. They landed on a runway still under construction, bouncing over coral rocks. The plane broke apart on impact, but both men walked away. Taylor later said, "That plane shouldn't have made it, but the B-17, it just wouldn't quit." That sentiment was echoed by hundreds of crews. The B-17 earned nicknames like Old Ironsides and the Workhorse. It wasn't the fastest, it wasn't the most advanced, but it was dependable. It brought men home, even when it was obsolete. By 1945, the B-29 Super Fortress had taken over the strategic bombing of Japan. With pressurized cabins, remote-controlled turrets, and a range of 3,250 miles, it was the future. The B-17 was phased out of frontline bombing in the Pacific, but it didn't disappear. Instead, it found new roles. B-17s dropped mines in the Shimonoseki Strait, the narrow passage between Honshu and Kyushu. These aerial mining missions, called Operation Starvation, choked Japan's last sea lanes. Ships couldn't move coal from Hokkaido to factories in Osaka. Oil tankers couldn't reach Tokyo. The economy ground to a halt. Other B-17s dropped propaganda leaflets, millions of them, warning civilians to evacuate before firebombing raids. Some crews hated this. "We spent years trying to kill them, and now we're handing out flyers like door-to-door salesmen?" But others saw it as mercy. War was brutal enough. And in the final weeks of the war, B-17s performed one last act of humanity. After Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, Allied forces discovered thousands of prisoners of war starving in camps across Southeast Asia. Many were too weak to walk. So B-17s were loaded not with bombs, but with food, medicine, and clothing. They flew low over camps in Thailand, Manchuria, and the Philippines, dropping crates with parachutes. Former POWs wept as they saw the silver wings overhead, not as harbingers of death, but as angels of deliverance. One survivor, British soldier Arthur Dodd, wrote, "When I saw that B-17, I knew the nightmare was over. Those men in the sky, they didn't know my name, but they saved my life." That was the legacy of the Flying Fortress. It began as a mocked machine, written off by enemies who saw only its size and not its soul. But in the hands of brave crews, it became a symbol of American resolve, industrial, strategic, and deeply human. The Japanese had laughed in 1941. By 1945, they were silent, and the sky, once empty, was filled with the roar of fortresses, not to destroy, but to heal. When you think of the B-17 Flying Fortress, you might picture silver wings gleaming in the sun or rows of machine guns blazing against enemy fighters. But the real heart of the B-17 wasn't in its engines or its armor. It was in the 10 men who climbed aboard for every mission. Strangers at first, brothers by the end. Each crew was a microcosm of America itself. The pilot might be a farm boy from Iowa. The bombardier was a college graduate from Boston. The radio operator, a jazz lover from New Orleans. The tail gunner was a quiet kid from Montana who'd never seen the ocean until he shipped out to the Pacific. They came from different towns, different faiths, and different walks of life. But once the hatch closed and the engines roared to life, they became one unit, one family, one life. And that life hung in the balance every time they crossed the coast. Training was brutal. At bases like Wendover Field in Utah or MacDill in Florida, crews spent months learning to fly, shoot, navigate, and survive. They practiced formation flying until their eyes burned. They drilled emergency procedures, engine fires, oxygen failure, bailout, over and over. They learned to recognize enemy fighters by silhouette alone. But nothing could truly prepare them for combat. One gunner, Corporal Frank Delaney, recalled his first mission over Rabaul. He recalled, "I was so scared I threw up in my oxygen mask. I thought, I'm going to die today. But then I looked at the guy next to me, our flight engineer, and he just gave me a nod, like, we got this. And somehow that was enough." That bond was everything. In the air, there was no room for ego. The pilot relied on the navigator to find the target through cloud and storm. The bombardier needed the pilot to hold steady during the bomb run, even as flak burst all around. The gunners protected everyone, but they couldn't see the whole sky. Only together could they survive. And when one man fell, the others carried his weight. Take the story of Lieutenant Robert Bob Jenkins, co-pilot of Heaven Can't Wait. On a raid over Truk in April 1944, a 20mm cannon shell from a Zero tore through the cockpit. It killed the pilot instantly and shattered Jenkins' left arm. Blood sprayed across the controls. But Jenkins didn't panic. With one hand, he grabbed the yoke. With his teeth, he pulled the radio mic and called for help. The flight engineer climbed up, tied a tourniquet, and helped him fly for 6 hours back to base. Jenkins lost his arm, but he saved the crew. He later said, "I wasn't thinking about medals. I was thinking about getting my guys home." That was the unspoken oath of every B-17 crew. No one gets left behind. But sometimes, despite their best efforts, men were lost. Over the Pacific, rescue was especially hard. If you bailed out over the ocean, your chances were slim. Sharks circled, currents pulled you away, Japanese patrols hunted down survivors. Many crews carried a Mae West life vest and a small rubber raft, but inflating it in rough seas was nearly impossible with frozen hands. Still, miracles happened. In July 1944, a B-17G named Sally's Revenge was shot down near Palau. All 10 crew bailed out. 7 landed in the water. For 3 days they drifted, rationing a single canteen of water and eating raw fish they caught with safety pins. On the 4th day, a U.S. Navy PBY Catalina spotted their dive marker and landed on the open sea, a rare and dangerous maneuver. The pilot taxied through swells for hours to reach them. All 7 were rescued. Back at base, they hugged the PBY crew like long-lost brothers. Not everyone was so lucky. The 394th Bomb Squadron lost an entire crew in November 1943 during a raid on Wewak. Their B-17 vanished without a distress call. Decades later, wreckage was found deep in the New Guinea jungle. Engines buried in vines, cockpit glass shattered, and dog tags still hanging from the radio panel. The families had waited years for answers. Some never got them. Back home, mothers, wives, and sweethearts lived in a kind of suspended grief. They'd get a telegram, "Your son is missing in action." Then silence. Weeks. Months. Sometimes a letter would arrive, written before the mission, full of hope and jokes, unaware it would be the last. One mother kept her son's room exactly as he left it for 20 years, just in case he walked through the door. The emotional toll was invisible but deep. And yet, new crews kept coming. By 1944, the U.S. was graduating over 100,000 aircrew members a year. Training bases buzzed with activity. Young men who'd never flown a plane before were taught to navigate by stars, calculate bomb trajectories, and fire 50-caliber machine guns with deadly accuracy. They learned to trust their instruments more than their eyes. They learned that fear was normal, but quitting wasn't an option. Many never made it to combat. Training accidents claimed hundreds of lives. A B-17 was unforgiving if mishandled. Stall it on takeoff and it would cartwheel into the ground. Lose an engine on climb-out and you might not have enough altitude to recover. But those who survived training entered a brotherhood unlike any other. Once assigned to a bomb group, crews stayed together for the duration. They ate together, slept in the same Quonset huts, played poker with cigarette packs as chips. They gave their plane a name, painted it on the nose, and treated it like a living thing. If it brought them home, they patted its fuselage like a loyal dog. If it was damaged, they stayed up all night helping the ground crew patch it. Ground crews were heroes too. Often overlooked, these mechanics, armorers, and electricians worked 18-hour days in mud, rain, or scorching heat. They crawled into bomb bays to fix wiring. They hand-loaded 500-pound bombs in the dark. They patched bullet holes with tinfoil and glue. One ground chief in the Marianas said, "I don't care if I never see a medal. I just want my boys to come back alive." And when a plane didn't return, the whole base felt it. There was a ritual. At dusk, if a B-17 was overdue, the mess hall would go quiet. Men would look toward the runway. If the sky stayed empty, someone would lower the flag to half-staff. No announcement was needed. Everyone knew. But for those who completed their tour, usually 25 to 35 missions, there was a different kind of weight. Survivor's guilt. Why me? Why not him? Many refused to celebrate. They'd pack their bags, say quiet goodbyes, and board a transport plane back to the States, haunted by faces they'd never see again. Yet the B-17 also gave them something rare in war: purpose. Unlike infantrymen stuck in trenches or sailors trapped on ships, bomber crews saw the direct impact of their work. They watched factories burn. They saw convoys sink. They knew their bombs kept enemy troops from reaching the front. In a war of unimaginable scale, they had agency. They chose to fly. They chose to fight. And they chose to protect each other. That sense of meaning carried many through the darkest days. Now, you've probably heard of the Memphis Belle, the famous B-17 that completed 25 missions over Europe and returned home for a war bond tour. Hollywood made a movie about it. But fewer know that in the Pacific, crews often flew far more than 25 missions. The 5th Bomb Group had crews with 50, even 60 combat flights. There were no parades for them, no newsreels. Their war was quieter and lonelier, fought over endless ocean and steaming jungles. But their courage was no less. One such crew flew a B-17 nicknamed Pacific Pearl. Based out of Espiritu Santo, they hit targets from Bougainville to the Philippines. On their 41st mission over Formosa, they took heavy damage, 2 engines out, hydraulic lines severed. The ball turret gunner, Private Eddie Morales, was mortally wounded. As the plane limped home, Morales whispered to the radio operator, "Tell my mom I did okay." He died before they landed. The crew buried him at sea the next day, his dog tags wrapped in an American flag. Stories like that were common, but they rarely made headlines. And that's part of why the B-17's Pacific legacy has been overshadowed. In Europe, the bomber war was massive, visible, and close to home. In the Pacific, it was scattered across thousands of miles, often supporting naval operations or ground troops. Yet without the B-17's relentless pressure, cutting supply lines, destroying airfields, isolating islands, the island-hopping campaign would have cost far more lives. The B-17 didn't win the war alone, but it made victory possible. And for the men who flew it, it was more than a machine. It was a promise. A promise that if they did their part, if they held formation, dropped their bombs, and watched each other's backs, they might just make it home, even when the odds said otherwise, even when the world laughed. The B-17 Flying Fortress wasn't born perfect. It was forged in failure, refined in combat, and reborn again and again, each version tougher, smarter, and more deadly than the last. What began as an experimental prototype in 1935 became, by 1945, one of the most iconic machines in military history. And its evolution tells a story not just of engineering, but of adaptation under fire. Let's start with the early models, B-17B through D. These were the planes that arrived in the Philippines in 1941. Sleek, yes, but vulnerable. They had only 5 machine guns, no tail turret, no ball turret. Their fuel tanks weren't self-sealing, so a single incendiary round could turn the wing into a fireball. And their Norden bomb sight, though revolutionary, was useless in cloudy Pacific skies. After the disasters at Clark Field, Boeing went back to the drawing board. The result was the B-17E, introduced in 1942, and it changed everything. This was the first true flying fortress. It was longer, heavier, and far more defensive. Boeing added a tail gunner position with twin 50 caliber machine guns, finally giving crews a way to fight off attacks from behind, the most common and deadly approach used by enemy fighters. They installed a powered dorsal turret on top, operated by the flight engineer, and a Sperry ball turret underneath, manned by the smallest crew member who could squeeze into the cramped sphere. Armor plating now shielded the cockpit and critical systems. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced fire risk. The rudder was enlarged for better control. And the total number of machine guns jumped from 5 to 10. Later, the B-17F added waist gun windows that could be opened for better visibility and airflow, though gunners still froze at high altitude. But the real breakthrough came with the B-17G in 1943. By then, German and Japanese pilots had learned to attack head-on, flying straight at the bomber's nose, where early models had almost no defense. The B-17G fixed that with the chin turret, a pair of 50 caliber machine guns mounted under the nose, operated by the bombardier. Now the B-17 could defend itself in every direction: front, back, top, bottom, left, and right. It carried 13 50 caliber machine guns in total. Each fired 800 rounds per minute. In a full defensive burst, a B-17 could unleash over 10,000 rounds per minute into the sky, a literal storm of lead. Enemy pilots who once dove with confidence now hesitated. One Japanese Zero pilot, after surviving an encounter with a B-17 formation, wrote in his log, "It is not a plane, it is a porcupine with wings." The B-17G also had improved engines, Wright 1820-97 Cyclones with turbochargers that allowed it to maintain power at 30,000 feet. Its top speed reached 287 miles per hour. Range, 2,000 miles with a 6,000-pound bomb load. Service ceiling, 35,600 feet. At that altitude, above most weather and enemy fighters, the B-17 reigned. But technology alone didn't win the war. Tactics did. In the Pacific, U.S. commanders adapted the European combat box formation to fit the theater's unique challenges. Instead of tight multi-squadron boxes, B-17s often flew in smaller V of V formations. 3 planes in a V, 3 more behind them, making it easier to navigate over featureless ocean and respond to threats. They used radar-equipped lead planes to find targets through cloud cover, and they developed fighter affiliation drills, practicing with P-38 Lightnings and later P-51 Mustangs once long-range escorts became available. Maintenance innovations kept them flying. Ground crews in the Pacific worked miracles with limited tools. They used coconut husks to clean engines. They patched bullet holes with rubberized fabric and aircraft dope. When spare parts ran out, they cannibalized wrecked planes, sometimes flying a mission with an engine salvaged from 3 different B-17s. One mechanic in the Solomons famously kept a B-17 airborne for 6 months using nothing but duct tape, wire, and sheer willpower. And the crews themselves became engineers in the sky. They learned to feather a damaged engine to reduce drag, to redistribute fuel to keep the plane balanced, to use the rudder to compensate for lost ailerons. One pilot, after losing all hydraulics over truck, landed his B-17 using only engine power and manual trim tabs, a maneuver so difficult it was considered impossible in training manuals. This culture of improvisation extended beyond the battlefield. Back in the U.S., factories raced to improve the design. At Boeing's Plant 2 in Seattle, workers, many of them women, known as Rosie the Riveters, assembled B-17s with astonishing speed. They installed electric de-icing boots on wings, added better oxygen systems, upgraded radios for long-range communication. Each change was based on combat reports from the front lines. If crews said, "We need more ammo storage," engineers made it happen. If gunners complained about frost on turret glass, heated sight systems were developed. The B-17 became a living machine, constantly learning, constantly evolving, and its influence didn't end with the war. After 1945, hundreds of B-17s were converted for civilian use. Some became airliners, though their narrow fuselage made them impractical. Others were used for aerial mapping, forest fire spotting, and even drone control ships during nuclear tests. In the 1950s, modified B-17s flew weather reconnaissance missions into hurricanes, earning the nickname Hurricane Hunters. One such plane, Swamp Ghost, flew into Typhoon Karen in 1962 and survived winds over 150 miles per hour. But perhaps the B-17's greatest legacy is in the pilots and engineers it trained. Men who flew or maintained the Flying Fortress went on to shape the post-war aviation industry. They helped design the B-52 Stratosphere, whose wingspan and mission profile echoed the B-17's. They pioneered jet bomber tactics. They led NASA's early space programs. The discipline, precision, and teamwork forged in B-17 cockpits became the foundation of modern air power. Even today, the B-17 inspires awe. Of the 12,731 built, only 45 remain. 4 are still airworthy: Texas Raiders, Aluminum Overcast, Sentimental Journey, and 909. These flying museums tour the country, their radial engines roaring like ghosts from the past. Veterans often visit them, running their hands over the cold metal, tears in their eyes. Some bring their grandchildren. This is what Grandpa flew. This is how we won. One such veteran, Staff Sergeant Henry Hank Miller, flew 38 missions in the Pacific. At age 96, he climbed aboard Sentimental Journey for one last flight. As the plane taxied down the runway, he whispered to the pilot, "Take her up slow, she likes it that way." When they landed, he kissed the fuselage and said, "Thank you for bringing me home." That emotional connection is rare in military history. Most war machines are forgotten, scrapped, rusted, erased. But the B-17 endures, not because it was the fastest or the most advanced, but because it represented something deeper: resilience, ingenuity, brotherhood. And it played a quiet but crucial role in the dawn of the atomic age. In 1945, while B-29s prepared to drop the atomic bombs, B-17s flew support missions. They conducted weather reconnaissance over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They dropped leaflets warning civilians to evacuate. After the bombs fell, B-17s carried scientists and photographers to survey the damage. One such mission, flown by a B-17G named Big Stink, captured the first aerial photos of Hiroshima ruins, images that would shock the world and help end the war. Even in that moment of unimaginable destruction, the B-17 was there, not as a weapon of annihilation, but as a witness to history. And in the months that followed, it helped stitch the world back together. B-17s dropped food to starving civilians in Japan and Korea. They airlifted medicine to POW camps. They ferried diplomats and aid workers across the Pacific. The same plane that once rained bombs now carried hope. That duality, destruction and deliverance, is the true legacy of the Flying Fortress. It was mocked at first, written off as obsolete, laughed at by enemies who saw only its size and not its soul. But in the hands of brave men, it became something more. It became a promise that even in the darkest hour, America would not back down, that it would build, adapt, and fight not for glory, but for freedom, and that no matter how many times it was shot down, it would always find a way to rise again. The war ended on a quiet morning in August 1945. No grand battle, no final charge, just a radio broadcast from Tokyo, a stunned silence across the Pacific, and then relief, so deep it felt like grief. For the men who flew the B-17 Flying Fortress, victory came not with fanfare, but with exhaustion. They stood on muddy airfields in the Marianas, New Guinea, and the Philippines, staring at the sky they had crossed so many times, wondering if it was really over. Some cried. Some didn't speak for hours. Others simply climbed into their bunks and slept for 2 days straight. They had done what they set out to do. The empire that once laughed at the B-17, calling it a joke, a relic, a paper fortress, now lay broken. Its cities smoldered. Its navy rested on the ocean floor. Its air force was a ghost. And the skies, once claimed by the rising sun, now belonged to waves of American bombers that had turned the tide not with a single blow, but with relentless, grinding pressure. The B-17 didn't sink the Yamato. It didn't win the Battle of Midway. It didn't storm the beaches of Iwo Jima. But it made all of those victories possible. It cut the supply lines that fed Japan's war machine. It destroyed the airfields that launched kamikaze attacks. It isolated garrisons until they withered. It forced the enemy to fight on American terms, on time, on distance, on industrial might. And in doing so, it saved countless lives. Because every ship the B-17 sank was one less troop carrier heading to Okinawa. Every factory it bombed was one less Zero rolling off the line. Every rail yard it cratered was one less train carrying ammunition to the front. This was war not of spectacle but of attrition, and the B-17 had a quiet engine. Yet, for all it accomplished, the Flying Fortress was never meant to be the star of the show. It was a workhorse, a bridge between eras. Born in the age of biplanes, it fought alongside jets by war's end. Designed for precision bombing, it adapted to skip bombing, mining, leaflet drops, and mercy missions. It was replaced by the B-29, then forgotten by history books that focused on D-Day, the Bulge, or the atomic bomb. But those who flew it never forgot. In the decades after the war, B-17 veterans gathered at reunions, small, humble affairs held in VFW halls and airport hangars. They didn't talk much about medals or kills. They talked about the guy who shared his last candy bar, the time they landed with 3 engines out, the friend who never came back. They told stories not to boast, but to remember. And they fought to keep the B-17 flying. When the Air Force scrapped hundreds of fortresses after the war, veterans raised money to save a few. They restored them with their own hands, sanding rust, rewiring radios, and repainting nose art from memory. They taught new generations how to start the engines, how to read the gauges, and how to feel the plane's soul in the stick. Because the B-17 wasn't just metal and wire, it was memory made visible. Today, when you see a B-17 roar overhead at an air show, listen closely. That deep, throaty rumble of its 4 Wright Cyclone engines isn't just sound, it's the voice of history. It's the echo of 10,000 missions, of young men who left farms and factories to fly into storms of flak and fire, of crews who trusted each other with their lives, of a nation that, when tested, rose not with anger but with resolve. And it's a reminder of a timeless truth. Never underestimate the underdog. The Japanese made that mistake in 1941. They saw a big, slow bomber and assumed it was weak. They didn't see the factories behind it, the training fields, the spirit of the men who flew it. They mistook humility for helplessness, and that miscalculation helped seal their fate. History is full of such moments. The slingshot against the tank, the outnumbered fleet, the quiet invention that changes everything. The B-17 is one of them. But this story isn't just about planes or battles, it's about people. Think of Captain Colin Kelly going down with his plane in the first dark days of the war. Think of Sergeant Eddie Morales whispering, "Tell my mom I did okay," as he bled out over the Pacific. Think of the ground crew in the Solomons who kept a B-17 flying with parts from 3 wrecks. Think of the Japanese child in Kagoshima who decades later would thank an American veteran for dropping leaflets that saved her family from a firebombing raid. War is terrible, but within it, humanity endures. The B-17 carried both, destruction and compassion, fear and courage, loss and hope. It was a weapon, yes, but also a lifeline, a symbol, a promise kept. And that promise was simple. We will not quit. Not when we're bombed at Pearl Harbor, not when our planes burn on the tarmac, not when the enemy laughs. We will build, we will train, we will fly, and we will return again and again until the job is done. Now, more than 80 years later, the last of those crews are leaving us. The men who climbed into those cold cockpits are in their late 90s or gone. Their stories are fading from living memory. That's why it matters, more than ever, that we remember. Not just for them, but for us. Because the lessons of the B-17 are still alive, in a world that still underestimates quiet strength, that still confuses size with weakness, that still needs reminders that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's flying anyway. So, the next time you see a photo of a B-17, wings spread against a cloudy sky, gun ports dark but ready, pause for a moment. Honor the 10 souls who once filled that space. Honor the ground crews who kept it flying. Honor the families who waited and worried and sometimes mourned. And honor the truth that changed the war. Sometimes the thing the world laughs at is the very thing that saves it. If this story moved you, if you saw your grandfather in these words or felt a connection to this history, please don't let it end here.
Share this video with someone who loves history. Leave a comment below. Tell us about a veteran in your family, a museum you visited, or a B-17 you saw in person. Maybe you've stood beneath Memphis Belle at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force. Maybe you've heard a veteran's story at a school assembly. Those moments matter. Because history doesn't live in textbooks, it lives in us. And if you believe stories like this should be told, if you want more deep dives into the machines, missions, and men who shaped our world, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Every click helps keep these stories alive. The B-17 Flying Fortress is more than a relic. It's a lesson, a legacy, a last flight home. And as long as we remember, it will never truly land.